Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by returning guest, Dr. Shaun Blanchard. Shaun, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Dom. Great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, the topic of today's video is going to be on the Synod of Pistoia and liturgical reform. But before we get into it, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests for any newcomers. So Dr. Shaun Blanchard is Senior Research Fellow at the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a graduate of North Carolina, Oxford, and Marquette. Shaun writes on a variety of topics in early modern and modern Catholicism. He is the author of the Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, and with Ulrich Lehner co-edited the Catholic Enlightenment, a global anthology. Forthcoming works include an anthology of Jansenist sources, co-edited with Richard Yoder, and Vatican. And this one's already published, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Vatican II, a very short introduction, co-authored with Stephen Bullivant. He lives in. You recently moved, is that right, Shaun?
I will be moving in about a month.
Yep. Okay, so all right, so we'll leave it at that. So, okay, Shaun, welcome to the show, and I'm really excited to get into this topic. I read some of the stuff you sent me, and it was very eye-opening. So let's go ahead and jump into the context of our discussion. Can you maybe give us a brief background of the Synod of Pistoia itself, situating it historically and thematically?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed the part of the book, and then some of the Jansenist anthology that Rick and I are coming out with it's probably going to be another year before it's out at least. But okay. I have translated about 7,000 words, I think, from the Synod of Pistoia, from the liturgy decree. There are two decrees that concern liturgy, and we'll go into this later, but there's a decree on the Eucharist, which is Eucharistic theology, piety, et cetera. And then there's a decree on public prayer, which is not just Mass, but other, processions and things like that. So very, very interesting documents, very controversial documents, and they'll be in English for the first time. They're available in Italian and actually they're available in many languages, but have never been translated into English. So that has happened partially for the first time. Historically speaking, so we'll start with just kind of what was the Synod and what happened, and then we can talk about kind of thematically what's going on there. But historically speaking, it is the Bishop of Pistoia. Pistoia is a medium-sized city outside of Florence. I think it's about 25 miles outside of Florence. At this time in history, this is the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. So we're talking, this is 1786. It's pre-French Revolution. It's pre-unification of Italy. There's different principalities and kingdoms around Italy, including the popes. The Papal States was one of the largest and most important. So the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and that is ruled by the younger brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Emperor is Joseph II. He's the son of Maria Theresia, the great empress. And she dies in 1780. Her son Joseph is now the sole ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, or at least of the crown, Habsburg crown lands. His younger brother Peter Leopold, who he in many ways sees eye to eye with, at least about the issues that we're going to discuss, is the Grand Duke of Tuscany, resident in Florence. Their little sister is Marie Antoinette. So this is one of the most important, powerful families in Europe, and they're pretty serious Catholics. They take their faith very seriously. It didn't always stop them from having lots of lovers and things like that, but they like a lot of European monarchs at the time, they did take their role as the protector of the faith and the people's faith very seriously. So he appoints Peter Leopold through negotiations with Rome, manages to get a bishop appointed named Scipione de' Ricci, and we'll probably go in more detail about him later. But he convenes, with the permission and the encouragement of the Grand Duke, he convenes a diocesan synod. So he's actually the bishop of a conjoined diocese, Pistoia and Prato. They both have magnificent cathedrals that I highly recommend if anyone gets a chance to just a little day trip from Florence. And they're so nice there because they don't get the amount of tourists Florence gets. So if you come and you're interested in their city, they're really, happy and accommodating. But anyway, Ricci convenes a diocesan synod. It's about 250 clergy. parish priests. He has some outside Italians come in who are all in total lockstep with him theologically. They're all ranging from Jansenist sympathizers to kind of full-blown as Jansenist as you would get in the heart of Paris or Port Royal. That's what Ricci is, certainly. So they meet for 8 days. They have pre-prepared documents. They deliberate, they vote, and they promulgate all these documents on things ranging from, diocesan financing, redrawing parish boundaries, all the way to like grandiose ecclesiological statements. So it's really a kind of strange thing, because why is this little Italian diocese, relatively unimportant diocese, having this kind of massive, it's almost like a Tridentine level of detail, which we'll come to. So that's what happens at the Synod. It is, as we'll discuss later, it's explicitly antagonistic to the papacy, to the religious orders, especially the Jesuits, the legacy of the Jesuits, who at this time are suppressed. But Ricci is protected by the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So the Pope, it's Pius VI at the time. The Pope has had no luck in his negotiations with Emperor Joseph II. He's had no luck with Peter Leopold. He can't really do anything about it. He wants to, but he can't. Now, as we'll get into, this all changes with the French Revolution, and ultimately the papacy decides that the reward outweighs the risk, or the pros outweigh the cons of condemning the Synod of Pistoia. So there's a massive committee, or not a massive committee, but a committee that meets for a very, very long time. And they finally publish a condemnation in 1794 on the Feast of St. Augustine, very deliberately as a kind of we own the interpretation of Augustine, not you. And it's called Auctorum Fidei, the author of faith. And that condemns 85 propositions taken from the Synod. And so this is really a very important doctrinal document. It is not very well known, but the legacy of this document, it's more like Uni Genitus, or the Syllabus of Errors, as far as importance, even though it's this relatively obscure diocesan synod. I mean, in the sense that this is 250 priests in Italy, headed by one bishop. There's only one bishop in attendance, but the symbolic power of this challenge to ultramontane Catholicism grows and grows and grows in importance, and that's when Pius VI ultimately decides to condemn it. Now, thematically, what's going on here, and we can go into more detail later, but there's really 3 streams that kind of converge in the Synod of Pistoia, which is why it's so important. On one hand, you have a kind of enlightened Catholicism, maybe a more moderate view of reform that we would associate with people like Ludovico Muratori, who we've talked about before, an Italian priest and historian who dies in 1750. And the Pope, who was beloved by all these figures, Benedict XIV, and he dies in 1758. And as we discussed last time, his death really leads to a lot of fracturing. He kept the peace to some extent between warring schools within the church. And after his death, it's a kind of unstable situation that leads to the suppression of the Jesuits and to a really radical aggressive strains of reform. So number one, a kind of moderate enlightened Catholicism. Number two, a Jansenism, which is not at all moderate, is extremely combative, extremely aggressive, has very beautiful ideals in certain ways, but also will die on lots of hills. And that's part of probably its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. And then finally, you have what we call regalism. So this is a kind of it's an ecclesiastical and political ideology that you see in the courts of the Bourbons. You see certainly with Joseph II, that's called Josephinism. And Peter Leopold is really following in this mold. So he is the term they used in Italian, vescovo esteriore, bishop of externals. So he is a kind of quasi-apostolic figure who, by divine right, is sort of shepherding the church of his lands. So he's looking back. They're looking back to Constantine Theodosius. They talk about Alfred the Great in England, and these are the kind of models, these powerful Christian monarchs who are the sort of shepherds of the church in all matters except doctrine. but where that line is drawn, of course, is not, as usual, is not agreed upon. So that's what's happening here ideologically: a kind of moderate enlightened Catholicism, a very aggressive Jansenism, and a regalism all converges in this obscure Tuscan diocese.
That's all very fascinating. And so, reading through what that chapter you sent me, I kind of had this feel of not just a Pistoian ressourcement, but a little bit more radical than that, a kind of primitivism on the one hand, and they were pushing against a kind of Jesuit scholasticism, even though they're gone by now. The legacy is still there, and yet the ressourcement open to aspects of the Enlightenment side is against ultramontanism. And so here you have this interesting flip-flop, you might say, with today, where it's actually those who are wanting to retrieve the scholasticism prior to the council that I think it's fair to say kind of got jettisoned over too much, maybe. But they are also pushing against ultramontanism because the papacy today seems to be not in line with what they want. And so it's interesting. Reading your work really has made me second guess myself and take a closer look at the traditionalists and be a little more sympathetic. I still disagree with the direction in which they're going, but I definitely have much more sympathy. And I can even concede many things to them, just like I would say I could concede things to the Jansenists at Pistoia. Now, and that actually brings up, we're going to talk about how Auctorium Fidei condemns them, why, how. But let's actually get into this so-called primitivism, or back to the early church outlook that the Pistoians had. And it comes with this idea of a general, maybe even radical obfuscation. The truth has been, obfuscated in a pretty strong way according to them. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that my work has made you more sympathetic to people that you disagree with. In these polarizing times, that's always a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a challenge because you can look at people on Twitter going crazy and saying offensive things, and you can want to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. But a lot of these people have prayer lives that they feel are under threat, or that they have good things they're trying to defend, and they can go too far. But a hermeneutic of charitable, of openness is always good. I had to do it as a young man with some of the older Catholics who were fighting battles that the young were not fighting, and that could be very frustrating. But now I feel like I know where they're coming from a little bit more. Okay, so the obscuration of the truth. So this is the fundamental claim, or the kind of root, the fountain of all of this. And the papal commission that condemned Pistoia really figured this out right away. And the first condemned proposition. Why don't I'll read the first condemned proposition.
Okay.
In Denzinger. So it's proposition number 2601. And it says, the proposition that asserts, so when the Pistoians say this, quote, in these latter times, there has spread a general obscuring of the more important truths pertaining to religion, which are the basis of faith and of the moral teachings of Jesus Christ. And they cite a particular line from one of the Pistoian documents. And the censure, so there's always a kind of level of error attached to these teachings. The censure attached to this is heretical, which is the highest possible censure. My favorite censure is offensive to pious ears. But the all the way up at the top is heretical. And I think there are only eight of 85 propositions are censured as heretical. All of them are ecclesiological. So
I think that's important for what's going on. Yeah.
Very, very important. And they correctly see this as fundamentally an ecclesiological challenge to what they would see as the true Catholic belief. Where the Pistoians would say it's papal monarchy or ultramontanism. Anyway, now with this idea of a general obscuration of the truth in Italian, they wrote this in Italian, by the way. So the original text of the Synod is in Italian, not in Latin, which in and of itself is noteworthy. Generale oscuramento. This highlights their primitivism. So we're familiar with primitivism from Protestantism, especially radical Protestants who would say, everything went to hell after Constantine, or everything went to hell after maybe Fourth Lateran, or, it depends on the Protestant, right? So in Anglicans, it would be much later probably. And then for like Anabaptists, it would be really, really early. So this is a Catholic primitivism. So they're not denying the ordained priesthood, the real presence, or the office of the papacy. They accept the office of the papacy. But what they do is they tend to want to kind of keep development within the first 5 centuries. So they really think Augustine figured it out. And if the Pope differs from Augustine, then woe to the Pope, because Augustine figured it out. Papal predecessors gave their stamp of approval on Augustinian theology. So they look back to the bel tempo, the bel secoli, the beautiful times. And they're citing awesome people that we love, Ambrose, Augustine, Athanasius, but their whole system is that quite a lot of what happened after this was wrong, or at least was not ideal. And the big moment for them is the initial break is Gregory VII. So there's a speech to open the Synod of Pistoia by a former Dominican who had been made into a diocesan priest. I can't remember the technical term, by Ricci. His name's Bartoli. And he gives this fiery speech, and he talks about there was this usurpation of the Christian Republic. So the Christian Republic, meaning the whole kind of Catholic unity of the faith, was wounded by Gregory VII's huge claims to what they would call earthly power, or the rights of the emperor, or something like that. So they're very anti Gregory VII. He's the 11th century, very aggressive, reforming, ultramontane pope. They then identify another kind of fall with Trent is good, Charles Borromeo is good. There's a lot of stuff going on, but the Jesuits hijack everything. So the Jesuits, sure.
Sorry to interrupt you. I did notice that they often actually did appeal favorably to Trent over and over again, and even to Borromeo, who was a reformer, and actually St. John the 23rd was very familiar with Borromeo when he opened the Second Vatican Council. And but it's after that they're unhappy with things that took place. So I found that interesting, just to point out. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's really important, because I think there's a misunderstanding. I think sometimes people think, well, Jansenists were French, and the French, resisted the disciplinary decrees. They refused to publish them because they said it violated the rights of the crown and the Gallican Church, but they did not resist the theological ideas. And the Italian Jansenists in particular, the ones I'm the most familiar with, were I think genuinely enthusiastic about the Council of Trent. Now, I think behind closed doors, they would say the decree on grace, or the document on divine grace, is insufficiently, it rightly condemns Pelagianism, Calvinism, Lutheranism, but it is insufficiently Augustinian. I think they didn't think it was ideal, but they took very seriously, we are in line with the Council of Trent, not the Jesuits. So in one way to interpret the Synod of Pistoia, if you go back in time, most of my book is going forward in time, and it's looking at Vatican I and Vatican II. But if you go back in time, it is a battle over the reception of the Council of Trent. And so this is, I think, an interesting point. Today we have people go, Vatican II is ambiguous, and Trent was clear. Trent had anathemas, and there was this golden age of orthodoxy. Well, Trent, there's much to commend the Council of Trent. It was incredibly successful in many ways, but it wasn't clear in the sense that the people at the time stopped arguing about all those issues. They still argued. They argued about ecclesiology, which wasn't really addressed very much for good reasons. They argue about liturgy. They argue about reading the Bible. They argue certainly about divine grace, and they're all appealing to the text of Trent. They're all saying, I'm a Molinist, or I'm a Thomist, or I'm a Jansenist, or whatever it is. So the Council of Trent is being debated in the 1780s. People don't agree about what it means and what is the right course for the church to take. And the Synod of Pistoia is an important moment in that. So anyway, but just briefly with the Jesuits, so the two, they have a million problems with the Jesuits, but the two main ones are they think Molinism is heresy. So they don't think Molinism is like a Thomist. Most of the Thomists at this time would say Molinism is not really, it's not right, but it's permissible. We're right about how we conceive of physical premotion and, a kind of compatibilist predestination, or however they would put it. Molinists are wrong, but it is a permitted theological opinion. Now, the Jansenists would say it is a heresy. So the Jesuits are actively spreading a heresy that is going to lead people to hell, because they're going to think that they're the authors of their own salvation, works righteousness, that kind of thing. Similar critique Calvinists would use at so-called Arminianism. Then the second thing is the practice of the Jesuits in the confessional. And this goes back to Pascal. Pascal is just Antoine Arnaud on frequent communion, and then Pascal just ripping the Jesuits about saying, well, if you sleep with your housekeeper once a month, it's not really habitual, and you don't need to, stuff like that. Now, to what extent was that calumny? And that in many cases, this probably was not actually what Jesuits were saying, but there was a sense that the Jesuit perspective on moral theology in the confessional is lax, and that will also lead people to hell. So that's the decline and fall of the Catholic Church, or the decline of the Catholic Church for Jansenists, is an ecclesiological problem where Gregory VII pushes papal authority way out of the patristic, what they believe the patristic scope to be, and then the Jesuits having moral and doctrinal, basically heretical ideas. So that's the obscuration. So what Pius VI is saying in this document is, you can have problems with Molinism and you can argue against it. You can have problems with laxity and argue against it. But he's essentially saying, if you're saying these things are heretical, you're the heretic, because that's basically what's going on here.
In a certain sense, it attacks the continuity and indefectibility of the church in its tradition, which is a very fascinating dynamic, because the communio, for lack of a better categorization, theologians at Vatican II were ressourcement, and they did believe in some level of a need for reform because things weren't ideal, but they weren't like the Jansenists insofar as they believed the church had lost its path and lost tradition and lost its indefectibility. So it's funny, because through Vatican I up to Vatican II, especially because of Vatican I, you have this possibility of a reform that doesn't repudiate the past and yet does indeed reform it. I think you brought up somewhere else the document by Pope Benedict on the hermeneutic of reform. And to me, that kind of ties. What I'm trying to say is, I see a historical dialectic in tradition itself. And we don't want to deny the objectivity of the deposit of faith, but also we don't want to make it purely propositional and ideological, right? And kind of anyway, my point being is that I really do see in Benedict, he is wrestling with this dialectic, and that I think that's also what motivated his criticism of the liturgical reform. Anyway, now I'm talking too much, but I think
drawing connections. I mean, because most people are not necessarily interested in what happened in 1786. What does this mean for Catholic theology today, or what does it mean for kind of the broad sweep of the tradition? So no, I think it's important to make these connections. And what you're saying about race, this is the challenge, right? Is it is kind of a spectrum, right? Because if you're calling for reform, something has gone wrong, right?
Yes.
So you'll find like deeply conservative authoritarian reformers in the Middle Ages who are saying really, really negative things about what's going on in the church, but they just think it's tough love. They're not saying the church is not indefectible, but and again, in the Jansenists, so there's a document that is printed helpfully, I believe in this book. I have these massive Italian books. I joke that I have the largest library on Italian Jansenism in Louisiana. And it's probably, 20 books, but some of them are massive. But it's a document. Ricci writes the Pope a letter after Auctorem Fide, the bishop, and he defends himself point by point. And he says, and now one way he can defend himself is because of the way the document was drawn up very deliberately by a very, very good theologian named Sigismundo Gardil. I can't remember what religious order he was. I think he was a Barnabite, and he was a cardinal. He was made the prefect of propaganda fide. So he's a very important cardinal. And he attached on many of the condemnations, he says, if understood to mean X, Y, Z. So such and such is erroneous or heretical or whatever the censure. If by that you mean blah, 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 blah. So Ricci was able to say, oh, well, that's not what I mean. And Pius VII, so Pius VI dies in a French prison, and Pius VII is elected, and Italy, there's peace in Italy again, and Ricci meets with him personally, and Ricci's in tears, and is really wounded by his rift with the Pope, and he hugs Pius VII. He says, I didn't mean any of the propositions the way that they were condemned, and Pius VII, which is ridiculous, but and Pius VII says, of course not. I never would have imagined that you did. And they have this really touching moment of reconciliation. Yeah. And then one of the Pope's aides, who was a real kind of zealot firebrand, says something like, you've still caused grave scandal, or something like that. And then Pius VII says, oh, you're my brother, brother Ricci. And so it's there is some happiness once the dust settles. But at the time, this document is basically saying this is a heretical, or at least if any of these 80 things are understood this way, then it's
right.
There's big problems. Anyway, sorry, I
no, it's great.
Off track with that anecdote.
No, this is great. And that's the thing, in reading what you sent me and talking to you now, this is our third video, I think, maybe fourth, I can't remember. So many connections are taking place in the way I'm understanding the current situation in light of history. And so you kind of covered the anti-ultramontanism of the Pistoians. They have a kind of Episcopalism. So this is interesting, I find. Ricci especially and his circle, they have a much more collegiality, but at the expense of the primacy in a certain sense. And that's why speaking of that historical dialectic, because of Vatican I, you are now able to have a collegiality at Vatican II that maintains the primacy.
Right.
And that does seem to me to be a kind of return to the early church's vision without repudiating the developments, which is brilliant to me. So anyway, that being said, you covered the Constantinian arrangement, the kind of the church became too worldly. We should be a church of service. I saw that in the chapter as well, much more of a spiritual power. If there's anything you want to say about that before we get to liturgy, go right ahead.
I guess I would say they say a lot of really beautiful things about like divesting themselves of earthly power, and in some ways they put their money where their mouth is, where I do think there was a emphasis on charity, and there was actually, paradoxically, there was an emphasis on paying priests appropriately, because they wanted parish priests drawing appropriate wages, so that they didn't have this weird dynamic where they were chaplains only of rich people and private chapels and oratories, but they were actually able to serve the people and not necessarily charge a stipend for masses and weddings and all this stuff. So there's this whole kind of chaotic ecclesial life, and some of it's really beautiful, but some of it was really kind of dysfunctional, and they're trying to clean that up, and that's really positive. The negativity is that all the power, there's never a vacuum of power, right? So a lot of the power that they want to take away from the Curia and the Pope is just going to the government. So that's great if it's a good Grand Duke who Ricci thought, Peter Leopold really had the best intentions. But if you have a bad, it's the same problem, right? It's like all the power is in someone who's just hooking up his friends with, wealthy positions and milking the church financially and all that. So it doesn't really solve the problem of, you can denounce papal tyranny, but if then you have like royal tyranny, like it doesn't really matter. So I think
tyranny.
They were sincere, but it's just, you're trading one problem for the other. And obviously with the French Revolution, when the rights of the Gallican Church passed to the National Assembly, that is a real like, oh shit moment for a lot of them. So some of these guys actually back away. The Jansenist community splits over whether they support the National Assembly. So Scipione de' Ricci, the Bishop of Pistoia, does support the National Assembly, but many of his colleagues do not. And some of them actually rally around the Pope, because once the Pope's running from French armies, they go, whoa, whatever theological disagreement we have, the Pope is being, is in prison by some, Corsican atheist or whatever Corsican deist.
Napoleon, yeah.
So the one way to bring the church together is to start being persecuted, and that happens to some extent here.
That's funny because, that's kind of, I see similarities there too, right? When, there's this push for something good, but then it backfires, and then people trace their tracks, back. Yeah. And I see some of the traditionalists doing that. And in fact, I think that's good. Because, you hear this this talk of the false spirit of Vatican I. Well, I mean, that's kind of the project. That's kind of the project of Vatican II, the reformers, especially Congar in his diary. He's the way he talks about ultramontanism is. I'm like, are you a trad? It's like
it's scathing. It's absolutely scathing. And even Ratzinger, I think there's an anecdote about Ratzinger arriving in St. Peter's because he's an assistant. He's a theological expert at the council, advising I think it's the Archbishop of Munich, and he looks up at the gold lettering, that thou art Peter, tu es Petrus, upon this rock supra, whatever. I'm blanking on the Latin, but he looks up at it and he makes some negative comment about it. He makes some comment like, is this about Christ or about Peter? Yeah. And it's like, that's like a unthinkable, when you look at the post Vatican II trajectory, it would be like, the defender of papal power is Ratzinger, but actually, in the 60s, he was anti-ultramontane insofar as he thought there was this kind of inflated view of papal power. So it is funny, all this, and then now you have trads who are like, maybe the problem's Vatican I. Like that is fascinating to see.
It really is. And your work has really been enlightening in that area. And I want to say, I do think Ratzinger, I take him at his word when he said that, he didn't change. And yet I do think he did. Now, I don't think I'm not contradicting him. I think he changed in order to stay the same. But he did change. And that's why he didn't. And if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, and how can you be, I mean, he
definitely developed.
Pastor and theologian for 70 years. I mean, from the 50s to he passes away, this year, right? He passed in January. 2023. I saw his tomb. I was in Rome. A couple of weeks ago, and I was in the CDF archives for the first time, and I was actually looking at files on the Synod of Pistoia, which was really, really cool. On the committee, the preparatory committee to produce Auctorum Fidei, and what precise censure, and do we condemn this? Do we not condemn this? Yeah. It was the personal file of Cardinal Gonzaga, who was actually the nephew of a kind of pro-Jansenist cardinal anyway. But I visited St. Peter's and walked into the crypt. It was a Sunday, so I went to mass at the back altar, which was really beautiful. Sean O'Malley was there, the cardinal from Boston, and they had the little door open to go down into the crypt. And I wandered down there, and the first tomb on the left was Ratzinger. And it really hit me. Oh, he's like gone. Yeah, he's there right now, or he's awaiting the resurrection. And
he's part of church history now. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. He is history now, and that's
so sad. Because I love the man, but
it is sad, but it's also kind of beautiful in the sense of this man has, there's all this beautiful stuff he produced. He was loved. He was hated. There was all this controversy during his pontificate, and now he's resting. And now we can sort of receive his life as part of this much bigger story, with good and bad and genius and problems. And so it was a nice moment, but it wasn't like, oh, whoa. I'm never going to see a photo of him, hobbling along with his cane in the garden or what have you. Anyway, sorry, getting off track again.
It's great. Anything you want to add? But we might have to do a part 2 if you're willing. But
we haven't even gotten to liturgy yet. Yeah.
But
all right. So we've gone proposition 1. Okay, in 36 minutes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So the next question I have on the list, and feel free to fill in anything you want to. So my question here is: can you speak of lay participation in the Pistoian liturgical reform? In basically understanding the liturgy, the audible canon, for example. Can you open that part up?
Yeah, definitely. So going back to the ecclesiological, they think one of the obscurations was a rupture between priest and people. Mm-hmm. Now they're totally Orthodox Catholics when it comes to, there is a ministerial priesthood. There is an ordination that is separate. So they're not Protestant in that sense at all. But they emphasize the baptismal priesthood. They talk about liturgy as an action common to priest and people. That's one of the lines. That is not condemned. So the anti-Pistoian people agree with that, but they don't agree about how the Pistoians are applying it. And it's this line between, this is an era where they're starting to make clearer distinctions between doctrine and discipline, but it's still a little bit murkier than we would understand it today. But I would say in the condemnations, they never attach heretical to any of the liturgical ideas. They'll say like erroneous, rash, offensive to pious ears, whatever it might be. Now, what the Pistoians essentially propose, and we can go into greater or lesser detail as you wish, but they essentially propose a reform of what we would call the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. They are trending towards the vernacular, but they stop short, and they essentially say it's not yet opportune. But behind the scenes, they're preparing for it. And Ricci actually publishes a missal in 1789 that is essentially trying to transition into the vernacular. So when they say it's not opportune, they mean literally right now in September 1786, it isn't opportune, but we're working on it. So it is an imminent thing. And the cardinals figured this out. I was looking at their arguments about it, and one of them said something like, "This is even worse than Canel," meaning the bull Unigenitus attacking Canel. So they say, Canel said it is sin to snatch away from the people of God the means of participating in the liturgy, to snatch away. Whereas the Pistoians say it is sin to not provide. So they said, well, that's actually more aggressive, because that's actually saying that the pastors in Italy, Spain, parts of Germany are not providing whatever translated missals or catechetical instruction. So they stop short of the vernacular, but they say the priest should instruct the people in the vernacular during the Mass about what's happening. So this actually is what was going on in the 1940s and 50s. So you would have with these, you had dialogue masses.
Even Guardini, I think, participated in some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is why the trads will say, oh, look at the Synod of Pistoia. It's Vatican II. It's a dress rehearsal for Vatican II. Now there's huge parallels, but what it really is, in my reading, I'm not an expert in liturgical history, but in my reading, it's what liturgical movement people are doing in the 40s and 50s is very close to this. So it's ad orientem, but they say there should only be one altar in every church. And it's this primitivist view. So they go back and forth, where ultramontanes will say, well, Gregory the Great talks about multiple altars. And then they'll say, oh yeah, but that's there was already some kind of confusion coming in the early church. It was one altar, and so they're sparring back and forth with history. One altar in every church, relics under the altar. They must be true relics. So they take the Tridentine decree on relics and read it very strictly. And this gets them in a lot of trouble, because the Italian people have no experience of vernacular worship, but they have a lot of experience with relics, flowers, images of Mary. So they really upset the devotional life of the people. Anyway, what were you
that's what I was going to say, that you see here the Enlightenment anti-superstition trajectory, which has good aspects to it. You can't say that's completely wrong. It's true. Like superstition is a kind of human, natural unfolding sometimes. But yet, as you say, they were so zealous about it that they were starting to destroy the devotional lives of good Catholics.
Yep.
And again, just if that's okay with you, that this is exactly what happened. I think
absolutely
today, removing superstition, because I think there was superstition, but in the process, the overzealous post-conciliar process after the Second Vatican Council, the traditions like processions and Eucharistic adoration got destroyed. But they're coming back, of course, as well, thanks, I think, a lot to Pope Benedict and other factors. But anyways, again, parallels, same thing.
Totally. And it really, it makes all sides look bad sometimes, and then it makes all sides kind of makes you more sympathetic to where people are coming from. But no, I completely, and this is a whole sweep of Christian history, probably going back into Jewish history too. But if you upset the prayer life of the people, there's going to be problems. So, Nestorius found this, right? Changing the hymns in that they can't sing Theotokos. They had all these hymns where that was, the refrain was Mary Theotokos. And he says, oh, you can't sing that. That was what got him kicked out or the revolt against him. So this is ultimately what derails Pistoianism, if you will, on the local level. The common Italian, 90% of people are illiterate. They don't understand. Ricci's printing all these pamphlets off about the papal monarchy and Babylon. They don't understand any of that. They have some sort of, the Pope is probably a good guy. He is in communion with the Archbishop of Florence. They have a sense that the Pope is important, but they're not participating at this level that the literate clerics are participating in. But kind of like a fight in Star Wars, spaceships fighting, and then all the debris comes down, and the debris is all this stuff about devotions. So they have good intentions. They're following what they think is a back to the early church sensibility, and also the good impulses of the Council of Trent. And Trent does say you should remove false relics. There was a huge problem of, relic peddling and stuff like that. But with the Pistoians, they at the very least are imprudent. So for example, the people of Prato, remember it's a twin diocese, Pistoia and Prato. The people of Prato believe they have what they call Our Lady's girdle, la cintola, the belt of the Virgin Mary. Yeah, there's 4 or 5 of them around the world. But anyway, they think they definitely have it, of course, because Mary would want it to be in Italy. So they have it in the Prato Cathedral. And the rumor that Ricci is going to remove that, and I think he was on the basis of the letters that I read. He denied that he was later, but I think he was. That leads to a rebellion, essentially, and they break in. He was luckily in Florence at the time because it might have gone poorly for him, but they break into his palace. So there's the bishop's palace and the seminary are right on the kind of near the main square. And they break into his wine cellar and they drink all of his wine. And then, and then they start shredding all of his books. For you. Yeah. Very, very good wine. I've had some of it because the family vineyard is south of Florence. Wow. And they're drunk on all this Chianti Classico, and they are shredding all of his books. They go into the cathedral. They start a torchlit procession. They go into the cathedral. They rip his episcopal chair out and burn it in the square. Because for them, he was threatening. This is a connection for them to the Virgin Mary, the apostolic age. And it's also there. It's linked with miracles. It's linked with Mary's favor over the city. So it would be like if in Naples, you tried to remove the blood of Saint Januarius or whatever the prize relic, the holy thorns from the cathedral in France that's Reims, isn't it? Reims? I can't remember. Or anyway, removing the prize relic from the community in early modern Catholicism is not going to go well. So at the very least, the Pistoians are imprudent here. But anyway, back to their sort of positive liturgical program. Yeah, they say there's been this separation where the action of the priest is seen as separate from the people, is the action of the people is seen as not important. They don't deny that a private mass could be efficacious, but they sort of question why anyone would have a private mass. So everything becomes around the parish mass. And they actually say everyone needs to go to their actual geographic parish. You don't go up in the mountains to your favorite oratory on Sunday where your family chaplain, who you pay money, says mass for just the family. You go to your parish church. They want the readings. I think they were doing the readings they were chanting them in Latin, and then they were reading them at the lectern, which is what you would find in most Latin masses today. So elements of it are kind of like a Novus Ordo Latin mass, and elements of it are kind of like the TLM right before Vatican II. Yeah. That's the basic, in a nutshell, that's basically what I would say. Oh, the canon is audible. So they basically say, and they had a really charged moment of debate because one of the priests was really mad about this, and another priest snapped at him and said, "We aren't Druids. We're not a religion of secrecy. We're not some sort of hermetic thing. This is the public worship of God." So audible canon in Italy in the 18th century is not going to get you very far with, certainly with the authorities. So audible canon, no organ music during the Eucharistic prayer, because they're trying to focus all the attention on the altar and have people understand what's going on at the altar. So they have really good intentions, but as we've said, they are imprudent.
I want to also bring up a kind of, again, it's tied to the Enlightenment, utilitarianism. But before we do that, this makes me think of the papal reform movements prior to the council with the Piuses, right? Pius X, Pius XII, active participation. They were, this is the Pope. We're talking about not, Pistoians that are against Ultramontanism. The popes themselves are in fact moving in a certain direction. So that's interesting right there as well. But when it comes to the central altar, the only altar, in fact, reading the general instruction for the Roman Missal in its initial phases, it defines the Mass in a sense where the definition includes in an essential way the assembly, and it ignores completely private low masses. Eventually, the definition doesn't change completely, but a footnote is brought in, or an additional clarification saying even the Mass where there are no faithful, the priest is acting on behalf of the church. And so I think that's a good example of both an acknowledgement of maybe a ressourcement while not repudiating later developments. That's, I think, another good example. But what was I going to say?
There's a post-conciliar push-pull with this, absolutely.
Yes,
like just how
the dialectic,
they're debating how to properly receive Trent, and they, as you saw, they appeal to Trent. They say Trent says, "Lest the sheep starve, the pastors must feed them, with instruction." What we mean by instruction is the Bible and what's the words of the canon, and then the other towns go, no, that's about catechesis, that's about being a spiritual director, that is not about the actual time in Mass. So they're debating just same way that after Vatican II, we're debating, well, hold on a second, does that mean you can't have a private Mass, or it's not edifying, or like what's the problem with it? It's exactly the same dialectic as you said. It is a dialect.
It is, and another thing, so because I do want to eventually get to the utilitarian question, but availability of Scripture for the faithful, especially in light of Dei Verbum and what the Pistoian project is doing. I saw that in the chapter, and because right away I remember, because my first class ever in college was on it was on the document the church produced about interpreting the Bible within the church. I can't remember the exact title.
Is that the Pontifical Biblical Commission, or
I think it is? I think Ratzinger had a hand in it as well. But it mentions the translations that need to be provided. This is something we need to push for. Coming from the reforms, and so scriptural literacy and the vernacular and the availability of Scripture for the faithful. Is there anything else we can say about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So this goes back, there are people in the 16th century arguing for this. There's not agreement at Trent about whether Scripture should be in the vernacular or not. They don't come to it's a sort of country by country, bishop by bishop thing. There's later a kind of anyway, we could go off on a tangent on that. But in France, the kind of French school of spirituality, Pierre Béroul, Francis de Sales, all these kind of great heroes, you have this as one stream of that. They're not all in agreement on it, but some of them want vernacular Scripture. There are French versions of Scripture. And Port Royal, which is the sort of center of early original Jansenism, Jansen's friend Saint-Cyran becomes a spiritual director, and the nuns of Port Royal are all about, French hymns and French Scripture and stuff like that. So Antoine Arnaud famously challenges his opponents and says, what a horrible, to deprive these women of Scripture like you're trying to do is horrible, because it's from the proudness, the proud vanity of men is what heresies come from, not women. Women don't come up with heresies. Men do, because they're vain or whatever. So it's a sort of interesting argument. Canel picks that up and says it would be foolish to deprive women of Scripture because they're more humble and they don't come up with heresies like men do. And that's condemned in Unigenitus. So the Pistoians are again, imprudently, they're advocating this beautiful thing that we all hopefully agree on now. Vernacular scripture should be available, not only available, but the papacy is now pushing this. Ratzinger, when Ratzinger was Pope, he was saying, people are yearning for scripture in their native tongue, and we have to provide this. And he's talking about people groups that don't yet have
Verbum Domini is another great.
It might be in Verbum Domini. I can't remember.
Probably.
I think it is in Verbum Domini, which is kind of a reversal at least on a kind of practical
disciplinary level.
So the Pistoians are right, in my opinion. Of course, people should have vernacular scripture, but they do it in a really combative way because they directly quote Canel. So the problem with this is it's like a tripwire where it's like the Vatican committee is immediately going to say, oh, this is reviving the errors of Canel and Wycliffe and Luther. Now, let me read the proposition. So Auctorum Fide number 67. So this is the papal condemnation. It says, the doctrine that asserts that only a true incapacity can dispense from the reading of sacred scripture. So what the Pistoian said was, if you're illiterate, of course, you can't read scripture. If you're someone who is having, some sort of crisis or problem, or you're too poor to afford a book, but it has to be literal incapacity. You are not capable of reading scripture for whatever reason. So the doctrine that asserts only a true incapacity can dispense from the reading of sacred scripture, and that adds, and the doctrine that adds that the obfuscation of the first truths of religion that has developed because of the negligence of this precept continues to spread. Okay, so this is going back to the ecclesiological claim. So the people after Trent or before Trent who were suppressing or not encouraging Bible reading are to blame for the obscuration. So this is a complicated condemnation, and it censures it as false. So not true. This isn't why there's an obscuration. Or incapacity is not the only reason. You could just not want to read scripture and still be a good Catholic. False, rash, disturbing to the peace of souls, condemned on another occasion in Canel. So that's saying, see this in Uni Genitus. Okay, so that's an interesting, one, because where I think the Ultramontanists their position is complicated by they're not simply anti-reading scripture. Some of them there were very paternalistic conservative people who just thought lay people just don't understand it and they get confused and it's not worth it. But most of them weren't like that. And the Archbishop of Florence, who was anti-Pistoia, he had very clashed strongly with Ricci. His name was Antonio Martini, and he was in the process. I think he had completed the New Testament, and he was in the process of completing a translation of the Old Testament in Italian. That became like the Douay Rhymes. That was like the one in every family home until I think the early 1900s, the Martini Bible. And he had the blessing of Pius VI. Pius VI wrote a letter to him, and it's the foreword. If you find an old Italian Bible from the 1800s, it's usually the Martini Bible, and there's the letter from Pius VI saying, "This is wonderful. You have my blessing," and all that. So we shouldn't simplify it as pro-reading scripture, anti-reading scripture. However, the Pistoians were, I think, right that this is a fundamental part of the Christian life. This isn't just hey, you're into the rosary and I'm not, or you're into This is fundamental for the Christian life, and I think that they were right about that.
And I agree, yeah. And could you say maybe that part of some of the impetus to not provide scripture so widely had to do with a reaction against the Reformation and what happened?
Yeah. I think late medieval. So they start getting. I know so much more about the early modern period. So if I go back too far, I might say something wrong. But as far as I know, you have widespread illiteracy in medieval Europe, but there's not a taboo on there being vernacular portions of scripture at the very least. People who have the Psalms and Proverbs, or people who have the four Gospels,
and also scripture was in art and told in cathedral windows. Yeah.
Right. But there wasn't the practice of as far as I know, individuals having an entire Bible with all 73 books. I don't think that was common. I think there were, you read the Imitation of Christ, you read the readings of the day, so people had access to parts of scripture in vernacular, but we just plopped the Bible down on our desk before the printing press, that wasn't, unless you're a monk or something, or a very wealthy person. After the printing press, there's tons of versions of the German Bible produced by Catholics.
Gutenberg,
yeah, exactly. The Spanish, very quickly, as far as I know, Spain and Italy tended to be very conservative about the vernacular, not in general looking askance at the vernacular. Northern Europe tended to be much more open about it. So the thinking was, then you have John Wycliffe, you have Jan Hus, and then of course you have Martin Luther. So the thinking is the common people can't really understand this. The Protestants come in and they, bamboozle them, and then they're heretics. So it was this sort of well-intentioned but very paternalistic, that everything has to be controlled by the parish priest and then the bishop and then the Pope. And it was this kind of, everyone fall in line, control the flow of information. I mean, the censorship of books in general was commonplace. So
can I just add another thing?
That was the thinking.
Yeah, no, excellent. Sorry, we won't go over time. Sorry, I kept cutting you off. But one thing that I find ingenious about Dei Verbum is it has both of these points, which is on the one hand, availability of Scripture. On the other hand, the only authoritative interpreter of Scripture is the magisterium, very clearly in Dei Verbum. And so I think, again, that's the people are going to accuse me of being Hegelian, but that's the synthesis of the antitheses, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Dei Verbum, and I point to this in my book, I think Dei Verbum really successfully receives what is positive out of early modern reform, and not the negativity. Now, the Pistoians would say, as every Catholic would say, it's not about individual interpretation. But there was a methodological clash where they would say the truth is basically our reading of the patristic and scriptural sources, and Rome is never going to bless that, right? So when you directly challenge, this is not me saying the way it should be, but just the way that it is. And reformers, whether you're a trad or a progressive or whatever, when you directly challenge the kind of methodological approach, you're usually it's not gonna go well.
Yeah, it's not always about the point you have. It might be a good one, a great one, or a bad one. It's really about, are you using it to attack our ecclesiology, or just not even ecclesiology, but is it going to work? You know what I mean? Like, is it going to be accepted? Not that you shouldn't fight for good causes. I think you should. But anyway, it's just practical.
Where the line is so hard. And I view this, as I say in the book, I view this as a tragic episode. Because so much of what Ricci and the Pistoians wanted was good and beautiful, but they completely shipwrecked. And I think Ricci was a very arrogant man. And when people disagreed, I think he was lovely to his friends. I mean, I've read thousands of his letters, and I think he had a good sense of humor. But when he was opposed and when there was conflict, he was not there wasn't a spirit of humility or docility at all. And that's not going to work when you're, when you're not the one with the supreme authority, at least. So it's like, on a practical level.
I'm trying to find a quote. Let's see, that you had in your text that's really helpful. Let's see. Okay, never mind. I can't find it. Oh well. Do you think we could do a part 2 eventually on your time? Of course, I know you're busy.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. I'm just thrilled anyone wants to talk about the Synod of Pistoia with me.
It is fascinating. No, I'm fascinated. Yeah.
Maybe I'll say something just briefly about the one reason why I think it's interesting to talk about this now. I think we talked about this off air, but I don't think we've mentioned this yet. The Synod of Pistoia is very obscure. I mean, people knew about it before Vatican II. It was in all of the textbooks. So you would learn a proposition, and then you'd see what all the support is. So Scripture, Fathers, Magisterium. So Auctorum Fide was cited all the time from 1850 to 1950, the canon law, theology, all these different textbooks. So people knew that there was this bad synod, but most people didn't know anything about the historical context of it. Congar looks into it a little bit in True and False Reform, not much. Ratzinger mentions it in the 60s as a kind of well-intentioned thing that went off the rails, and he compares it unfavorably to the kind of mania for especially liturgical and devotional change after the council, as you did as well. But it's come back into the news. So Vigano, Archbishop Vigano has mentioned it 3 or 4 times. Whether it's him or a ghostwriter or whatever, I don't know. But he's sort of popularized it again in kind of trad circles. It used to be a very, very obscure reference that only trads who are really into kind of what the liturgical story would know what it was. Archbishop Schneider mentioned it, or Bishop Schneider mentioned it on EWTN, mentioned the Synod of Pistoia with Raymond Arroyo.
I remember hearing that. Yeah.
That was, I believe, in the context not of Vatican II, but of synodality. Okay. So synodality, I think just because of the word Synod of Pistoia, it's sparked a little bit of interest, and historians are starting to pay more attention to it now. So I recently read a fantastic book by John McGreevy. I have it here, Catholicism, A Global History from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. McGreevy is a professor of history at Notre Dame, and he mentions the Synod of Pistoia 5 or 6 times because of the way that it plays out in the 19th century. So maybe next time we can talk about that. It's important. It is of importance to a certain type of reform-minded Catholic from Central and South America all the way to Lebanon. So in the 19th century, people are talking about it and debating it, and it's very important. And then finally, there's a great book on the development of Catholicism in Central and South America, and they read Tamburini, they read Ricci. Pius IX, in fact, in the Syllabus of Errors, 80 propositions are condemned. 7 of them are condemning a Peruvian politician who Pius IX accuses of being a Pistoian. This is in the 1850s, this document, which is then put into the Syllabus of Errors. So the afterlife of this is not just Vatican II, but it's all the way through the 19th century. So that could be something we could go into more detail about.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Yeah. So to kind of recap everything, we actually expected to go much longer, but too much to cover. This is so fascinating. This history actually has been deepening my perspective on the council and how it's actually not, because, I grew up thinking the council was revolutionary. It really isn't. It's a very moderate council. It takes a lot of the good that was kind of overlooked because of polemics, but it's also faithful to the tradition in the text in a way that, like, what we said about Dei Verbum, we haven't even gotten to Sacrosanctum Concilium. That's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
But I think historical perspective is so important, especially for people who feel like, the world is collapsing right now. And so, and this is why, I have strong disagreements with traditionalists, but I think this is helping me, develop compassion, sympathy, understanding. I personally, I love the 1962 Missal. It's the mass of my childhood. It's the mass of my faith, So, that's why I love Benedict. He's more conservative, you might say, than other popes or,
certainly
Pope Francis or John Paul II was, I think, he's interesting in his own right. But
on liturgy, there's no question. Pope Benedict's sympathies were way more traditional than John Paul or Francis, or Paul VI, probably.
Yeah, and theologically, I tend to side with him. Although for me, it's more of a that's where my affections are, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it really it's by muddying the water, not muddying them, but by complicating things. I think we can generate actually a little bit more peace and clarity. Actually, this is super helpful. We're gonna look at this again because it's a big topic, but definitely thank you for coming on the show, Shaun, and we'll have to do part 2 for sure. Let me go ahead and is there anything you want to say in conclusion?
I would just say, if you're interested in these issues, I'm going to write a short essay. Just what is the Synod of Pistoia? Why is it interesting now in light of liturgical wars and in light of the Synod on synodality? So I'm writing this short essay now. And then also this Jansenism anthology is hopefully coming out in probably late 2024. And then you can really delve into all the primary sources. So everything from a biblical translation that the first Portuguese Bible was done by a Jansenist oratorian named Pereira, all the way to a completely unhinged rant called "Jesus Christ Has Been Anathematized." That's by a French priest who was mad about Unigenitu's becoming state law, so he wrote "Jésus Christ sous l'anathème," and your pronunciation is much better. But Jesus Christ is under anathema, and he meant sort of the truth is being crucified. So you have and then you have letters from the nuns of Port Royal, how they're dealing with reform or persecution or whatever. So it's a really cool. It's men, women, bishops, lay people, 30 different texts ranging from the 1630s to about 1810. So we're really hoping it'll be something church history nerds will love, and then hopefully will be of use in the classroom. So that's something, if you are interested in this stuff, that to look out for.
Excellent. Yeah, and again, audience, check out Dr. Shaun and Stephen Bullivant's new book on Vatican II.
I have my author copies now, so it's very short.
There it is.
Very short introduction, 100 pages.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and put a link. I also linked it in another video we did, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll put a link in this one as well. So thank you so much, Shaun.
Thank you, Dom. Wonderful to talk with you, man.
Always a pleasure. And so, audience, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Comment down below. And if you enjoy this kind of content and you want to see more of it to make more sense of things going on, but also, sometimes it's good to unplug from church politics and read your scripture. Speaking of availability of scripture, right? Get back to the divine office and devotional life, Eucharist, confession. So support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. Check out our blog, the Ecclesia blog, www.theecclesiablog.com for good articles. And so without further ado, we'll see you guys next time. Bye.